I am one of 5 kids in a family. My brother's older than me, then there's me, and then I have 3 younger sisters. And there was this one time when I was a teenager, and one of my youngest sisters came home from Sunday school with a picture that she had drawn. It was around Easter time, and they had drawn pictures of Jesus on the cross. So my sister, brought home, she was quite young, I forget how old she would have been, 6 or 7 at the time, and she brought home her picture of Jesus on the cross. And she showed it to my mom, and my mom looked at it, and she noticed that at the bottom of the cross, my sister had drawn a whole bunch of rectangles and squares. And you know how you do with kids, you kind of go, oh, this is a really nice picture. You did a great job drawing this picture. Now tell me about these squares and rectangles. Why did you put those squares and rectangles at the bottom of the cross? And my sister said, well, those are mattresses. And my mom kind of said, oh, why did you put mattresses at the bottom of the cross? And my sister said, well, I don't want him to hurt himself if he falls down off that thing. Yeah, so okay, some things to explain there. But the beauty of that image is that my sister, who was, 6 or 7 years old, growing up on a farm, trees, hay wagon, the cows, there were lots of things to climb up on and fall off of. And we had all had lots of experience of climbing up high and falling down. And when you hit the ground, it hurts. So she was actually exercising some empathy. She was taking her own experience of being up high on something and seeing Jesus up there on the cross, and in her 6 or 7-year-old mind, she just didn't want him to hurt himself if he fell down off that thing. This was an exercise in empathy. She was putting herself in Jesus' shoes. She was taking her own experience, seeing his experience through the filter of how she understood life. And to some extent, that is what the season of Lent represents. The season of Lent is a time when we come to Jesus' journey towards the cross, that last month or so of his life, when he knew where he was headed, he knew what was going to happen. He was dreading it, but he knew that he was determined to go and face this thing. In the season of Lent, we put ourselves in his shoes and we see, what was that experience for him? How did he walk that road? How can we walk it with him, putting ourselves in his shoes? Jesus did know that he was headed for the cross, just as surely as we know that we are headed for Easter. Earlier in the book of Luke, Jesus had taken his 3 core disciples, his 3, the 3 on which he focused most of his teaching, most of the experience, the 3 who would become the leaders of the church after Jesus' departure for heaven, Peter and James and John. He took Peter and James and John, and they went up a mountain to pray. And Luke records that as Jesus was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became radiantly white. And suddenly, 2 men, Moses and Elijah, began talking to Jesus. They just appeared and started talking to Jesus. They appeared in glory and spoke to Jesus about his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Jesus knew what was coming. He had spent lots of time trying to forewarn his disciples, telling them, this is what's going to happen. I am going to die. And then 3 days later, I am going to come back. You're going to see that happen. They struggled to understand that. They couldn't. And, to be fair, they couldn't, because it had never happened. So, we don't want to judge them for not getting it, because we wouldn't have either. But Jesus knew what was going to happen. And Scripture says he set his face towards Jerusalem. He set his face. He just locked in on going to Jerusalem. He knew what was going to happen there, and he was determined, and he would not be waylaid from that mission. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at some stories from the life of Jesus, some events in his ministry, some events in his journey just as a human, in ministry, in life, as a rabbi, as a teacher, as a healer. Some of those experiences and how they may have prepared him for the cross. And also, what was the foundation he was leaving behind so that we would be able to understand better the work that he did for us on earth. That's going to be our next few weeks. We're going to look at some of those stories, a variety of stories, and see how they impact our understanding of Jesus' journey to the cross and the work that he did there. And this week, we're going to start by introducing ourselves to the apostles, the 12 men who Jesus called to be his particular followers, his closest students, his apprentices. The story of the calling of the disciples is not like some of the other stories we've looked at. There isn't one simple, 3 or 4 verses where we can go, okay, this, and, beginning, middle, and end of the story. It's scattered throughout the beginning of Jesus' ministry. His relationships with these men evolved and developed. And within the culture of rabbis and students, it makes sense. But it's not easy for us to necessarily point to one particular passage and say, okay, this is where it happened. But we'll get back to our scripture focus in a few minutes. But the calling of the disciples was not like, when Noah built the ark and God called the animals and, there were the animals and they just showed up and Noah did all the rest of the stuff. God didn't call the disciples that way. It didn't play out that way. It was different. It happened in stages because the apostles came to Jesus at different times, in different ways, from different places. Some may have come to Jesus on their own initiative. Some Jesus seems to have gone actively looking for. Others were introduced to Jesus by a friend. But to every single one of these 12 men, Jesus gave the command, follow me. And they did. And these 12 guys from different walks of life came to Jesus. They followed him to the very end. And they changed the world. So to understand some of this better, I'm going to define some words for us this morning. I'm going to define the word rabbi. I'm going to define the word disciple and the word apostle, because they are each very important, and they will be important to us as we go forward through the other stories, as we carry on through looking at Jesus' journey towards the cross. So the first word I want to define for us is rabbi. You may be familiar with this word. It's not unique to Jesus. The word rabbi was in Jesus' lifetime. It wasn't a formal title that someone would earn and be bestowed. It was an honorary title that people would give to someone in their community who they just recognized as being a teacher. Someone who authoritatively taught the Hebrew Bible to disciples. Jesus was recognized as rabbi by the people in his community in his time. He's called rabbi by his own disciples, by people in the crowd, by law teachers, by Pharisees. Even when the Pharisees were mad at him, they still called him rabbi. He was called rabbi by Sadducees, which was another group of religious leaders at the time. He was called rabbi by supporters, by opponents, by people who didn't care either way. He was called rabbi by men and women, by rich people, powerful people, and ordinary people. Jesus was recognized as a rabbi. A rabbi was a master teacher who would take on particular students and focus on teaching those students. This was a long tradition in Jewish history. It goes back at least as far as the prophet Elijah and his successor Elisha. Elijah was a prophet who led and spoke to the nation of Israel. Elisha was named by God as being the next in line to be that prophet. So scripture says in 1 Kings, Elijah went and found Elisha, and Elisha followed and served Elijah. It was that same master and teacher, or master and student relationship. And Elijah and Elisha stayed together until the end of Elijah's ministry, when Elijah was taken to heaven. You may recall that story in a chariot of fire. That's where that phrase comes from. Elijah went to heaven in a whirlwind or a chariot of fire. There's a passage a little bit later on in their relationship in 2 Kings where Elijah says to Elisha, please stay here, wherever they were at the time. Stay here, for Elijah says, the Lord has sent me to Bethel. But Elisha says, as surely as the Lord lives, as surely as you live, I will not leave you. I am going with you wherever you go, I'm there. So they went together to Bethel. And then while they were in Bethel, God told Elijah to go to Jericho. And Elijah said to Elisha, God has told me to go to Jericho. I want you to stay here, Elisha. And Elisha says the same thing. As surely as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you. So they go together to Jericho. And then while they're in Jericho, God tells Elijah to go to the Jordan. And again, same scenario. Elijah tells Elisha to stay. Elisha says, I will not leave you. So they go to the Jordan together. And it was important for them to stay together because in that master-student relationship, rabbis were responsible not only for imparting information, not only for teaching things about the law so that their students would have knowledge. The masters were responsible to show, I'm quoting from one of my commentaries, to show through their exemplary lives how to live by the scriptures. The prophet Ezra is described as having set his heart to study the law of the Lord, to practice it, and to teach it. To study, to practice, and to teach. And this is taken as the example of how a rabbi, how a teacher was to live with his students. He was to study. He was to get to know the Bible inside and out. He was to practice it. He was to live it. He was to set an example of what it looks like when we live this, and in addition, to teach it. So it was important for them to stay together so that the teachers could set that example. So when someone became a rabbi, they would create their own, what was called a school. It was called a house of study. And although it's called a house of study, they didn't stay put. They didn't, there wasn't like a schoolhouse. Rabbis would teach wandering around. They would go from town to town. Their disciples would follow them. They would talk on the road. They would find a place to stay for the night. The disciples would stay in the house with the rabbi. They would all stay together everywhere they went. The students were responsible for picking up that example, for imitating and almost becoming that same teacher. And around the age 30, the students would graduate to becoming a rabbi in their own right. And we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Just bookmark that in your brain. So the second word, that's a rabbi. That's what it looks like to be a rabbi, to learn scriptures, to live the scriptures, to teach the scriptures, to accept certain students who you were going to teach and shape into your own image, sort of. The next word we're looking at is disciple. The text that we read this morning said that Jesus, from among his disciples, he chose 12 and he called them apostles. So who were the disciples? The disciples were learners. The disciples were learners who had been accepted by the rabbi as his students. Students took the initiative of identifying a rabbi who they wanted to learn from. They found someone who they respected and who they wanted to become. This is who I want to be when I grow up. I want to be that guy. So they would identify a rabbi, and they would ask the rabbi to accept them as students. And the rabbis would accept the brightest and the best, the most talented and the cleverest. And to be accepted as a student by a rabbi was an honor. It meant that you were going somewhere. It meant that you were on the right track and that God was going to work through you to lead and guide his people in the future. So these remarkable kids, young men, would become disciples of the rabbi. And the disciples' task was to serve the rabbi, to look after his needs, and also to receive his teachings, to memorize, actually memorize his teachings. This was an oral culture. People didn't write things down. There were no blogs. Rabbis would teach, and students would memorize. That was just how people learned. So the disciples' responsibility was to gain the rabbi's knowledge, but even more importantly, said one commentator, even more importantly, to become like him in character, to take his rabbi's teaching to the community, to add his own understanding, but to raise up disciples of his own in the tradition of his rabbi. It all came back to that rabbi. Another ancient text tells disciples of rabbis, "Let your home be a meeting place for the wise, and dust yourself in the soil of their feet, and drink thirstily of their words." The image is of a teacher sitting on a chair or a stool, and his students being on the floor, sitting around him, at his feet, hearing what he says, memorizing it, learning it, understanding it, and adding their own understanding later on, but beginning by memorizing and imitating. And disciples would imitate their teachers, not only in the things that they said, but in everything, in what they did, how they spoke, their behavior, how they acted. One book said, if the rabbi shopped at Walmart, you shopped at Walmart. If the teacher said potato, you said potato. If your teacher cheered for Buffalo, you cheered for Buffalo. Everything in your life was modeled after how your rabbi lived, even down to little details. And then, after many years of study, many years of learning, of memorizing and learning how to think things through, then you would become a rabbi yourself. So no matter how the apostles, no matter how the disciples came to be Jesus' disciples, no matter how they arrived, whether Jesus went and found them himself, whether they were introduced by a friend, what matters is that these 12 made themselves available to Jesus. They attached themselves to him. They followed him. They traveled with him everywhere, listening as he talked on the road. They sat in the dust of his feet. They knew who he was because they recognized him as their rabbi. And these disciples, they embraced both honor and hardship in becoming a disciple of a rabbi. The honor was being accepted, being received and recognized as worthy of that investment of time and teaching, and knowing that you were going to go on to do good in your community. That was an honor. It was an honor to be accepted as the student of a rabbi. But it was also hardship. It was leaving your family behind. It was setting aside the career that your family had expected for you. It was leaving your own community and whatever future you may have had there so that you could go on the road to be shaped by someone else into their image, so that you could become like your master. In Mark chapter 3, the writer says that Jesus appointed the 12 so that they could be with him. That was the core. that proximity. That proximity was really, really important. It wasn't a big deal if you just want to pass on information. I can post a video online with information in it and never see the face of the person who receives that information. We have no relationship. They don't know me from a hole in the wall. They may think better of me than I am. They may think worse of me than I am because they don't know me. I'm just imparting information. But if someone is in my life, they're going to get to know who I am. They're going to get to know my weaknesses, my strengths, my virtues, my vices. They're going to get to know me far better than simply hearing what I said from a distance. That proximity was a powerful, powerful gift to the disciples and to the apostles later on. The time together with Jesus and with other followers of Jesus was the core of this relationship. But as I said, unlike with Elijah and Elisha, who, Elijah was the prophet, Elisha became the prophet. Unlike that relationship, Jesus' disciples did not become rabbis. That did not happen. That's not how their journey played out. Jesus identified his apostles, and then he kept them as disciples. Because Jesus himself is the rabbi. He is our rabbi today. He is our teacher today. We learn through each other. We learn from each other's examples. But Jesus is still the teacher. None of the 12 apostles ever graduated from being a disciple. When they died either of old age or of martyrdom, decades after Jesus' death and resurrection and return to heaven, they were still disciples. None of them ever graduated to becoming a rabbi. They remained disciples, just as we are Jesus' disciples today. Because Jesus didn't just want disciples, he chose apostles. And we're going to look at the word apostle. The word apostle, as it was used in classical Greek, is not the same way that Jesus uses the word. In classical Greek, it was mostly used either for naval expeditions or groups of colonists settling in a new place. And we could discuss, are we a group of settlers, colonists in a new place? Sort of, but not really. The word in classical Greek had a very specific meaning, and that's what it was, either a naval expedition or a group of colonists settling a new place. In the Jewish tradition, in the Greek translations of the Old Testament, they used the word for ambassadors that were sent out to Jewish people around the world with messages or instructions or to collect taxes. They were sent as apostles with a message, with a task to do. They got where they were going, they did their task, they came back, they were no longer apostles. That was it. The apostleship was for one task. You went and you did your job, and then it was over. But the way Jesus uses the word apostles is different. Jesus, in Matthew chapter 10, he says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has apostled me, as the Father has sent me, so also I am sending you." Jesus saw himself as being apostled from the Father, from heaven, to do his task on earth. And that task is not one that is going to be completed and then it's over. That task continues on into eternity. Jesus also called the 12 to himself and began to apostle them out 2 by 2, giving them authority to preach and to cast out unclean spirits. Jesus gave them that authority to go and speak, to deliver his message in his name. He gave them his authority and his power. And again, that task for them was never finished. In their lifetimes, they continued to be those apostles. When they became apostles, when Jesus first chose those 12 men, they had already become Jesus' disciples. They were already learning from him. They were already following him. They were already part of his orbit. But when he named the 12 as apostles, that was different. Who were these guys? Who were these 12? There was Simon. Simon, also known as Peter. His nickname was like Rocky. Peter was married. He was business partners with James and John. There was Andrew. Andrew had already been a disciple of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was apparently a rabbi, so Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist who discovered Jesus. There was Philip. Philip had also been a disciple of John the Baptist and was brought to Jesus by Andrew. There was Nathanael. Nathanael was brought to Jesus by Philip. He was somewhat cynical at the beginning, but in the end, he was the first one to really recognize that Jesus was the Son of God. There was Judas Iscariot. Judas was the treasurer, and he was embezzling and filling his own pockets from the money that was given to the ministry. There was Thaddeus, about whom we know very little. There was James, one of the sons of thunder, and John, one of the sons of thunder. John may have been the youngest because he lived the longest. There was Matthew. Matthew had been a tax collector before his conversion, before he started following Jesus. Matthew had been a collaborator with the Roman occupying force. And then there was Simon the Zealot, who was part of the resistance against the Roman occupying force, who sometimes used acts of violence. And Matthew and Simon together are this amazing pair for Jesus to have called to be brothers in ministry. Then there was James the Less. We don't know if he was called the Less because he was younger or because he was shorter. Tradition says that James took the gospel after Jesus returned to heaven, took the gospel to Persia, and he was martyred there. And then there was Thomas. Thomas was also called the twin. We don't know who his twin was, but he was profoundly loyal to Jesus. And in the end, he, as we understand it, took the gospel to India, and he was martyred there. These were the 12 guys. These were the 12 apostles who signed up for this honor and this hardship. And they must have known what they were signing up for because they were with Jesus. They were among the disciples when the event happened that we heard read this morning. Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees. He's arguing with the religious leaders. He's arguing with the people who have power, and he's making them angry. He's irritating them by committing an act of healing on the Sabbath. He's committing an act of mercy, but he's breaking the law. And the apostles, the men who became the apostles, would have seen this happen. They would have been there when it happened, and they would have known that this is what they were signing up for. They were signing up to be the disciples of a man who committed acts of mercy and broke the law and irritated the heck out of the people in power. And things didn't get any less complicated down the road. There were other times when they saw the Pharisees angry. There were other times when the apostles themselves just misunderstood and didn't understand. There were times when the apostles themselves actually got told off by Jesus. But they continued to follow him faithfully. They continued on into the church that became our earliest family. Continued leading, continued teaching. They empowered the next generation of leaders. They bore witness to Jesus' death and resurrection, and they continued to be Jesus' disciples. They continued to be learners from Jesus. They never, ever claimed that authority for themselves. None of them ever stood up and said, "I'm the rabbi now. Be like me." Their entire lives, they remained disciples. They did not claim authority for themselves. They continued throughout their lives to point to Jesus, to say, be like Jesus. And yes, they messed up. Yes, they abandoned him when he was taken to the cross. They panicked. They deserted him. 2 of them actually spoke out against him. And only one, as far as we can tell, went with him all the way to the cross. But the thing that they did right, the thing that they nailed 100%, is that they stayed together. They didn't know what was going to happen next. They didn't really understand Jesus' predictions of his returning to life because they couldn't. They couldn't understand it because it hadn't happened before. But when Jesus did return, he found them together. And they picked up where they left off, and they continued on being Jesus' disciples. So these 12 guys who we're going to be in company with for the next few weeks, learning about Jesus' journey to the cross. These 12 ordinary, regular guys, they were faithful. They stayed together. They learned and learned and learned. And they never claimed that authority for themselves. They continued always to point people to Jesus. And I think it's wonderful that in the book of Revelation, we read that the names of the 12 apostles are carved on the foundations of the eternal city. These 12 guys who we're going to be spending time with over the next few weeks, as they spend time with Jesus, they are the foundation for our faith and how we live it. They are our example. And we look to them for that. They went on carrying Rabbi Jesus' message into the world, as we are called to do.